Charlotte, although she's young, but remarkably steady, shows more respect for the crown than Meghan ever demonstrated. Reassigning Sussex to her isn't punishment, it's necessity. She will honor what Meghan treated carelessly.
Princess Anne had opened countless royal files without hesitation, but this one made her stop breathing. Buried inside a locked Windsor cabinet was a sealed letter in Queen Elizabeth's own hand, addressed personally to Princess Charlotte, and marked to remain untouched until a future date. Anne read the first page alone. Minutes later, she demanded an immediate meeting with King Charles, and refused to let palace aides enter the room. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne had entered Windsor Castle expecting routine duty, not a confrontation with the dead. She was reviewing protected papers moved after her mother's passing, when one envelope broke the rhythm. Windsor Castle also holds sensitive private family records. The outer instructions stated that the letter must remain sealed until Charlotte turned 18, then pass through Anne's supervision. But a newer order had been fixed over the Queen's handwriting, and the code beneath it belonged to the King's private office. The princess leaned closer, compared both instructions, and felt grief harden into fury. Someone had not merely delayed a family message. Someone had interfered with Elizabeth's final wishes and placed Charlotte inside a decision that could shape the crown. The crown means not only the monarch, but the authority, duties, and continuity of the monarchy itself. Anne opened the letter after seeing the alteration, and the first page made the danger worse. Elizabeth named the young princess the guardian of something the crown must never allow ambition to destroy. Yet it did not reveal whether that trust involved a duty, hidden archive, or privilege with deeper consequences. Charles answered Anne's call after the second ring. The monarch heard her identify the cabinet, envelope, and altered order, then fell silent long enough to confirm her worst fear. He asked exactly where she had found it. He ordered her not to speak to William until they had met privately. The command did not calm her. It told her the future king's father understood how explosive the letter could become. Anne returned the pages to the desk, locked the room herself, and told the waiting equerry that nothing was to move. An equerry is a senior royal aide who assists a family member with official duties, but even he was kept outside. She carried the letter away alone, knowing this was no dispute over paper. Charlotte, William, Charles, and Anne were bound to promises they understood differently. Before Anne could accuse the king of betraying their mother, she had to confront the more dangerous truth. Every person named by Elizabeth had something deeply personal to lose. The letter belonged to Charlotte, but the consequences belonged to everyone around her. For Anne, it was a final command from a mother she still mourned. For Charles, it threatened the authority he had spent a lifetime waiting to inherit. For William, it placed his daughter inside a struggle she was too young to understand. And for Charlotte, it carried the voice of a great-grandmother she could never question. Anne understood why the alteration felt so personal. Elizabeth had trusted her with difficult duties for decades because her daughter obeyed without chasing attention or reward. That trust had shaped their bond, and now someone had placed a new order over the Queen's final instruction, as though her words could be quietly corrected. The sovereign is the reigning king or queen, and Charles believed that position gave him the right to decide how private instructions from the previous monarch should affect the new reign. Yet Anne saw something more painful. She saw a brother using authority to weaken a promise their mother had deliberately placed beyond his control. Charles carried a burden Anne could not fully dismiss. He had waited most of his life to become king, only to inherit a monarchy still shaped by Elizabeth's presence in every room and every decision. He argued that a dead monarch could not rule through sealed letters, especially when those letters placed duties on William's young daughter. He insisted the delay was protection, not betrayal. Charlotte had never been asked whether she wanted the responsibility, and he feared she could be trapped by a promise made before she understood its weight. But Anne suspected another truth. If he truly wanted to protect the child, why had he hidden the letter instead of speaking openly to her parents? William received Anne's guarded call and walked toward Charlotte's sitting room, but he stopped before reaching the door. He heard his daughter laughing with her brothers, and could not force himself to enter. The prince knew one glance at his face might reveal that something had changed. He also remembered Elizabeth once mentioning that Charlotte might hold a special future role, though she never explained whether it involved ceremony, money, or protected family possessions. Now that unfinished conversation returned with terrifying force. Camilla watched Charles reread Anne's message at Clarence's house and immediately recognized the silence. The queen consort understood that anything involving Elizabeth could make him defensive, because his mother's judgment still reached him even after death. She asked whether the letter threatened the crown, but he answered that it threatened something more private, his belief that he alone could protect the next generation. Anne prepared to face him, not as a rebel challenging a monarch, but as a grieving daughter demanding the truth from her brother. Yet the conflict had not begun with Anne opening a cabinet. It had begun years earlier, during one final ceremony, when Elizabeth saw something in Charlotte that changed her plans forever. Long before the sealed envelope appeared, Queen Elizabeth had already made her choice. The decisive moment came after the Platinum Jubilee balcony appearance. When the noise faded, the family dispersed, and the aging monarch asked for Charlotte to be brought to her private sitting room. What occurred there lasted less than 20 minutes, but it created the promise that would later divide Elizabeth's children and unsettle the future king. Elizabeth had spent her final years worrying that royal duty was becoming confused with attention. Crowds, headlines, and titles could create the appearance of service, but she believed true loyalty appeared in private moments, when no applause was waiting. The Platinum Jubilee was the national celebration, marking 70 years of her reign. Yet behind its public triumph, the monarch was quietly deciding which values had to survive her. Anne understood that fear better than most. She carried private messages, protected confidential instructions, and watched her mother assign responsibilities that were meant to continue after her death. Charlotte changed everything with one small act. After the balcony appearance, Elizabeth struggled to retrieve a brooch that had slipped from her hand. The young princess noticed, picked it up, and returned it without drawing attention to the queen's weakness. She did not call for help. She did not turn the moment into a performance. Later that evening, the monarch summoned Charlotte, William, and Anne to her sitting room and said the child had shown the instinct to protect dignity before spectacle. William immediately felt the weight behind those words. He knew his grandmother rarely praised without purpose, and he feared she was placing an invisible burden on his daughter. Elizabeth asked Charlotte a few gentle questions, thanked her, and allowed her to leave before the real conversation began. Then the queen placed the brooch in Anne's palm, closed her daughter's fingers around it, and instructed her to safeguard both the jewel and a future letter until the girl reached adulthood. The princess accepted, but William objected. He told Elizabeth that Charlotte was still a child and should not be tied to a lifelong responsibility before she could understand it. The future king's concern was not rebellion, it was protection. The monarch assured him that the letter would offer a choice, not issue a command, and that Charlotte would remain free to refuse. Charles entered after the young princess had gone, and learned the deeper plan. Elizabeth intended to create an independent custodial responsibility, meaning a private duty to preserve and protect family material, beyond the control of any future royal household. The letter concerned her personal archive, family correspondence, private jewels, and records preserving the experiences of royal women. Charles warned that parallel authority could divide the monarchy. His mother answered without hesitation, conscience sometimes required protection from authority. Years later, those words would return with brutal force when Anne entered Charles's private room carrying the letter he had tried to keep beyond Charlotte's reach. There were no advisors, no private secretaries, and no carefully prepared statements when Anne faced Charles. She entered carrying the sealed envelope beneath one arm, placed the altered authorization on his desk, and shut the door herself. The king began to explain, but his sister cut him off with one devastating question. Had he delayed their mother's letter because he feared for Charlotte, or because he feared what Elizabeth had placed beyond his control? Anne remained standing while Charles stayed behind his desk, but the distance between them offered him no protection. She pushed the altered release order closer, and demanded the truth. A release order is an official instruction controlling when a protected document may be opened or delivered, and this one had moved the letter beyond Charlotte's 18th birthday while removing Anne from direct supervision. The monarch examined the code, lowered his eyes, and admitted that he had personally approved the delay. He denied changing Elizabeth's words, he denied destroying anything, but he could not deny that he had chosen silence. The princess felt years of loyalty collapse into anger. She accused him of using the crown to silence their mother after death, and the words struck harder than she expected. Charles rose so quickly that his chair moved behind him. He told her Elizabeth had made the decision while her health was failing, when every private instruction carried the risk of being treated as sacred law. The king argued that placing a protected archive in Charlotte's future care could turn a child into a symbol for rival palace factions. Courtiers might use her name to challenge George, pressure William, or suggest that Elizabeth had trusted one branch of the family more than another. Anne placed the letter between them. She told him protection would have meant speaking to William, not secretly changing the date and locking away the Queen's final words. Charles answered that he had consulted constitutional and household advisors. Constitutional advisors interpret how royal actions may affect the monarchy's legal and public structure, while household officials manage the family's private and official affairs. Their warning had been blunt. The archive could make Charlotte appear to be Elizabeth's moral heir, even without giving her constitutional power. Charles removed his glasses and placed them beside the authorization. His anger weakened. For the first time, he admitted the deeper truth. He could not begin his reign beneath another final judgment from his mother, especially one suggesting that the conscience of the monarchy needed protection from him. Anne heard the pain, but she did not surrender. She lifted the envelope and told her brother that William would hear everything before another decision was made. Anne had won the argument inside the room, but outside it, Charles still possessed the machinery of the monarchy, and that machinery was already moving to contain the damage. Royal power rarely announces itself with raised voices. It moves through locked files, rewritten schedules, private legal notes, and instructions delivered without signatures. Within an hour of Anne leaving the king's study, Charles's senior household officers were reviewing the Queen's letter, William's rights as a parent, and the limits of Anne's authority. But at the center of that machinery sat one shaken man, staring at the signature of the mother he had just been accused of betraying. Charles still held the formal power. As monarch, he directed the royal household, controlled access to protected royal archives, and could decide how sensitive family instructions were handled during his reign. The royal household is the network of officials who manage the sovereign's public duties, private affairs, records, and daily operations. Yet authority alone could not erase Anne's advantage. She possessed Elizabeth's original handwritten directions, remembered the Jubilee promise, and carried the moral credibility to expose any attempt to rewrite it. The king could command the system. His sister could challenge the reason behind every command. Charles dismissed the advisors and remained alone. He traced Elizabeth's signature with one finger, then whispered that she had never trusted him to understand her intentions. The admission did not sound like anger. It sounded like an old wound reopening. Camilla entered quietly and found him still bent over the paper. The queen consort urged him to separate his pain as a son from his duty as sovereign, because one came from grief while the other required judgment. He answered that the two had never been separate where his mother was concerned. William's position made the crisis even more dangerous. Legal authority over Charlotte belonged to her parents, which meant neither Charles nor Anne could complete Elizabeth's plan without his informed consent. The future king had not been consulted, yet palace officers were already debating his daughter's future. That mattered because Charlotte was not simply a royal figure inside an archive dispute. She was his child, and every hidden decision risked turning family protection into institutional control. A senior courtier then found the detail no one expected. The altered order had not only postponed delivery, it had transferred supervision from Anne to the sovereign's private office, removing Elizabeth's chosen guardian from the process. Attached beneath it was a second sealed inventory, listing correspondence, jewels, and private records reserved for Charlotte. One item, however, appeared only under a coded name: the Continuity Book. A courtier is a senior palace figure who serves close to the royal family, and even he understood that the missing description concealed the true center of the conflict. Charles ordered the inventory held back until he could speak to William, but the prince was already learning that officials had discussed Charlotte before informing him the letter existed. Once William understood that Charlotte's future had been discussed behind closed doors, the dispute stopped being a quarrel between siblings and became a fracture between the king and his heir. William did not shout when Anne placed the letter before him. His anger appeared in smaller, colder movements. He read the altered instruction twice, folded it with deliberate care, and moved Charlotte's photograph away from the documents as though shielding her from them. Then he told Anne that no king, advisor, or royal tradition would decide his daughter's future without first facing him as her father. William sat at Kensington Palace with Catherine beside him as he read Elizabeth's original instruction line by line. Kensington Palace is a royal residence that also serves as a private family home, which made the discovery feel even more personal. The prince's jaw tightened when he saw that the release date had been changed and Anne's authority removed. He felt betrayed by Charles for hiding the letter, but he also turned his disappointment toward his aunt. She had opened something addressed to Charlotte without first consulting the child's parents. Anne defended her decision, saying the altered order proved there was no time to wait, yet she could hear the damage in his voice. Catherine placed one hand near the envelope but did not touch it. She understood that Elizabeth's intention had begun with love, not control, and that made the conflict even more painful. The future queen insisted Charlotte must never believe she had caused division between her father, grandfather, and great-aunt. Her daughter was still young enough to trust every adult around her. Once that trust was broken, no palace statement could easily restore it. William called Charles directly. The king's private secretary answered first and offered to arrange a formal meeting, but the prince rejected the attempt. A private secretary is the senior aide who manages a royal figure's official communication and schedule. Yet this was not an official dispute. He demanded to speak to his father alone and declared that Charlotte's welfare was not a household matter to be processed by advisors. Charles listened without interrupting, then agreed to meet away from both courts. The prince acted before that meeting could occur. He ordered Charlotte's personal correspondence and inherited items temporarily removed from the Central Royal Archive and placed under the joint supervision of himself and Catherine. Anne understood why, but the decision still hurt. She had tried to protect Elizabeth's wishes and now realized she might have violated William's trust in the process. Catherine examined the inventory again and found the detail everyone had missed. The Continuity Book was described as a handwritten volume carrying private reflections from Elizabeth, Queen Mary, and the Queen Mother, passed between senior royal women to preserve truths official records ignored. Before she could explain its full meaning, Charlotte entered quietly and asked why Auntie Anne looked sad. The room changed at once. The conflict could no longer be resolved by documents or advisors. Before the family broke completely, William and Charles would have to meet not as heir and monarch, but as father and son. When William entered the room, Charles had dismissed every aide. The letter lay open between two empty chairs, but neither man reached for it. For once, there was no throne, no succession plan, and no palace office to absorb the blame. There was only a father who had spent his life beneath his mother's judgment, and a son determined to prevent his daughter from inheriting the same emotional burden. Charles had chosen Highgrove because it offered distance from palace machinery. Highgrove is the king's private country residence, a place meant for family life rather than official business, and that mattered now. Their phones remained outside. No secretaries waited nearby. No legal advisors could soften the words that had to be spoken. William sat opposite his father and began without ceremony. Charlotte was a child, he said, not a solution to unfinished arguments between generations of monarchs. The king did not defend himself immediately. He looked at Elizabeth's letter, then admitted through their private conversation that its wording had frightened him. The Queen had described Charlotte as the future guardian of values the crown must protect, and he had heard something harsher inside those words. He had heard his mother saying that he could not be trusted to preserve them. Charles confessed that he delayed the letter because he could not bear beginning his reign beneath one final judgment from Elizabeth. William's anger shifted. It did not disappear, but sadness entered beside it. The prince understood that his father had acted from insecurity and grief, not merely a hunger for control. Yet understanding did not make the decision right. He reminded Charles that fear could explain secrecy, but it could not excuse using royal authority to hide a choice involving someone else's daughter. The letter finally gave them the answer. Elizabeth had asked Charlotte, once she reached adulthood, and only if she freely agreed, to safeguard the continuity book and the connected archive of royal women. The continuity book was a private handwritten record containing personal reflections and family truths that official histories often left out. The roll carried no constitutional authority, meaning it gave her no legal power within the monarchy, no claim over George, and no control over William. It was an act of remembrance, entrusted to her because Elizabeth had seen compassion, restraint, and discretion. Charles picked up his pen. He signed an order restoring Anne as temporary custodian and agreed that William and Catherine would decide when Charlotte was ready to learn about the choice. The king admitted the delay had been wrong. The future monarch accepted the correction, but he demanded one final act. His father had to tell Anne himself. No aid, no note, no official cover. The private decision healed the deepest wound inside the family. But once the existence of Elizabeth's letter escaped the palace, the monarchy had to explain why a child's inheritance had nearly become a royal power struggle. By sunrise, the secret had crossed the palace gates. Britain did not know every word Elizabeth had written, but it knew enough. The late Queen had left Charlotte a personal duty, Charles had delayed it, and Anne had forced the issue into the open. The public reaction was immediate. Yet one image, not a statement, headline, or official seal, would come to define how the country understood the young princess at the center of it all. Charles approved the palace response before breakfast. The statement confirmed that a private family letter existed, and promised that Elizabeth's wishes would be respected according to Charlotte's age and her parents' guidance. A palace statement is the official wording released on behalf of the royal household, and every phrase matters because it shapes how the monarchy accepts responsibility. Advisors urged the king to blame archival confusion, but he refused. He authorized the words, "unnecessary administrative delay," knowing they would be read as a public admission that the letter had been held back without sufficient reason. Outside Buckingham Palace, the story became real. A crowd gathered beneath a newspaper billboard carrying the headline, "The Queen's Last Trust," beside a photograph of Charlotte quietly adjusting her younger brother's coat during a public appearance. Buckingham Palace is the monarch's official London headquarters, so the gathering there turned private family pain into a national moment. People did not see a child seeking power. They saw the same instinct Elizabeth had noticed years earlier: protect dignity, avoid spectacle, and act without demanding attention. A national broadcaster framed the dispute not as a succession crisis, but as the late monarch's attempt to preserve the memories of royal women through a new generation. Anne watched the coverage alone, and held her composure, until one commentator said, "Loyalty to the crown sometimes required challenging the person wearing it." The princess lowered her eyes. She had confronted her brother to defend their mother, but she also knew the cost had reached William, Catherine, and Charlotte. William refused requests for a public appearance. Catherine rejected every suggestion that their daughter should stand before cameras or become the face of the controversy. The prince and his wife agreed on one point: Charlotte's final choice had to remain private, free, and untouched by public pressure. Charles chose a quieter gesture. He sent his granddaughter a handwritten note saying only that her great-grandmother had admired her kindness and expected nothing from her before she was ready. The king mentioned no argument and offered no burden. Anne later placed the letter inside a new secure box bearing 3 names: Anne, William, and Catherine. Shared guardianship had replaced royal control. With the public storm beginning to settle, only one task remained. The family had to decide what Elizabeth's final trust would mean, and whether the letter would unite them after nearly tearing them apart. The final decision was made without ceremony. No proclamation was issued, no title was created, and no new royal power was placed in Charlotte's hands. Instead, Charles, Anne, William, and Catherine gathered in the same Windsor room where the letter had been discovered. Together, they restored Elizabeth's original instructions, protected Charlotte's freedom to choose, and ended the conflict by accepting the truth each had resisted. Charles reached for the altered authorization first. He removed it from the archive file, tore it once through the signature line, and placed Elizabeth's original instruction back on top. An archive file is the protected record used to preserve official and private royal documents, and this one had become the center of a family wound. The king's action did more than reverse a decision. It admitted that power had been used where honesty should have come first. Anne accepted the restored responsibility, but not as a victory. She would preserve the sealed letter and the continuity book until Charlotte turned 18, while William and Catherine would hold the right to delay disclosure if their daughter was not emotionally ready. The future king agreed, because the arrangement respected both Elizabeth's wish and Charlotte's freedom. The custodial role meant a private duty to safeguard family records, not a title, constitutional authority, or claim over anyone in the line of succession. Charles turned to his sister and apologized for removing her from the duty their mother had given her. Anne answered with equal honesty. She admitted that opening the envelope before speaking to William had caused pain that could have been avoided. Their conflict had begun with suspicion, but it ended with responsibility. William thanked his father for correcting the decision both publicly and privately. Yet he made one principle unmistakable. Protecting Charlotte must always come before protecting the palace from embarrassment. The prince had watched secrecy nearly turn his daughter into a symbol, and he would not allow that mistake to return. Catherine placed Elizabeth's brooch beside the sealed letter before the box was closed. The small object had begun the promise, and now it marked the restoration of trust. She understood that Elizabeth's true legacy was never the creation of another center of royal power. It was the belief that memory, compassion, and the experiences of royal women deserved protection beyond the pressures of succession. Anne's confrontation did not weaken Charles's reign. It forced him to admit fear, reverse a secret decision, and honor Charlotte's freedom. In doing so, it made the monarchy more human and stopped inherited insecurity from becoming inherited harm. The letter returned to silence, but the family did not return to secrecy. Elizabeth's wish was honored, Charlotte's childhood was protected, and Charles finally proved that preserving the crown sometimes begins with surrendering control. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.